Ian, you you told me that, or told us that you have a child with a physical disability and a child with mental health disorder. So how do you find the difference for a parent?
It's it's a big difference actually.
Mm,
My daughter with Down syndrome was my first child,
mm-hmm.
and when you think that life is all organized and you know how things are going to go,
Yeah,
and you have
yeah,
expectations,
mm,
and all of a sudden you have something that happens that you don't expect,
yes, mm-hmm.
and and again, ironically, I was doing research on Down syndrome
Yes,
before I
I've
had a
read
child
that.
with
Yes, mm-hmm.
Down syndrome. So when she was born, um, we had to teach her everything. We had to teach
Yeah,
her how to turn over. She wouldn't feed
mm,
properly.
mm-hmm.
We had friends who had children at the same time, and we watched how they were different. And we would go to a store, and with Down syndrome, the facial features are quite obvious, and people can tell
Mm,
right away, and notice
mm,
someone and know that they're going to be a little bit different. And some
mm,
people are uncomfortable with that, and some people are not.
mm-hmm.
I remember when she was very young, there would be children driving down our street, and they'd drive slowly on their bikes and kind of look at her. And then once I just stopped them and I said, "Hi, guys.
Mm-hmm.
She looks a little different, doesn't she?" And they go like this. I would think, "Yeah. Do you want to meet her?" And they go, "Yeah." And then come over and introduce them, and she would be okay.
Mm,
But it was a more obvious difference. And yes,
mm,
we had to
mm-hmm.
fight for schooling, and we had
Mm,
she had medical concerns that were stressful, and she was different.
mm,
But that was okay. I mean, I learned things from her I would not have
mm,
learned otherwise. Yes, we were wondering to what extent we contribute to having a child with Down syndrome, but it was a fluke, a
mm,
genetic fluke.
mm, yeah,
There's no other reason to explain that. So it wasn't a sense of
mm,
responsibility
mm,
other than perhaps bad luck.
mm,
And she was our first child and the first grandchild for both families. So this was a
mm,
big deal for
mm,
our family. And again, I've learned so much from her. When her sister developed an eating disorder, that was obvious. She was very thin, but the mental health issues were not obvious.
mm,
You don't see what's going on emotionally inside the brain. And in my case, because it was a mental health concern, uh, you, people used to say about having a child with Down syndrome, well, if God was going to give anyone a child with Down syndrome, God decided to give it to you because you have experience in Down syndrome. That's not the kind of response we would expect for a mental
mm,
illness, right?
mm,
Where you're
mm,
more concerned about, well, what are people going to
mm,
say?
mm,
You know, talk about a sense of responsibility
mm,
around
mhm,
that. Because in my family, I'm loaded with regards to my genetic loading for
mm,
depression and anxiety. And so happens, so is my
mm,
daughter's mother,
mm,
also loaded in terms
mm,
of depression in particular. So it's an invisible
mm,
disability.
mm, mhm,
My daughter didn't say anything to us
mm,
about it.
mhm,
She had to get very sick for us to do something
mm,
that led to discovering all of her other
mhm,
problems. So it's dramatically different from a stigma perspective in terms of the
mm,
visibility
mhm,
of it,
mhm,
even I think societal acceptance of it.
mhm,
Uh, the deinstitutionalization movement had already started with people with developmental disabilities. So we had many in our communities and more active and engaged in our schools and
mhm,
our recreation activities. But mental health was not as public.
mm,
It's more public now than it was, but not as public
mm,
at the very beginning. So much more stigma around
mm, mhm,
the mental health piece. And it goes full circle to when my sister had epilepsy and my
mm,
parents were concerned about that invisible disability involving the brain, maybe a little bit more embarrassing. So now I had a child with an invisible
mm, mm,
disability involving the brain,
mhm,
and I had one with a very visible disability. So the adjustment was quite different. I learned
mm,
from both though,
mm,
and you have to learn from both. And I'm stronger because I learned from both, and I was
mm,
willing to learn from both.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah,
And as far as I understand, they're both doing fine right now.
they are both doing fine. They're doing very well, actually. They.
Mhm,
I mean, they both have good jobs. They both have
mm,
quality of life. They have
mhm,
lots of friends and extended
mhm,
family, and and I think they contribute in many ways to life, and they have their
Mhm.
struggles too.
Yeah.
They're
Mhm.
human,
Mhm.
right? So they're
Yes.
human whether they have Down syndrome or they have an anxiety disorder or they
Mhm.
have depression
Mhm.
or they have some other kind of physical or mental
Mhm.
problem.
Mhm.
They're human and they can cope.
Mhm.
But I did mention the concern about shame and guilt.
Yes.
It is greater, from in my case at least, the
Mhm.
responsibility, the sense of
Mhm.
responsibility is I somehow have done this to my child because I have brought
Mhm.
genetics into it. But I also wonder to what extent I've brought different parenting into it because I also suffered and perhaps, at least in my child's early life, was not a great role model of accessing help
Mhm.
and using
Mhm.
help
Mhm.
effectively. I wanted to be the strong one.
Yeah.
And it took an 11-year-old
Mhm.
to try to seek help for me. Please help my father not be so
Yes.
sad.
Yes.
That I realized that I wasn't as strong as
Mhm.
I thought
Yes.
or as good an actor as I
Mhm.
thought.
Yeah.
And as powerful as I thought in terms of being that model of mastery for my children.
Mhm.
So now I'm a model of coping,
Mhm.
where I try to show them how I'm a person who just happens to have a mental illness.